Chapter 10, Role Morality. Much of what we've done throughout the course is talk about the different moral obligations engineers have. And we've sort of implicitly referred to role morality whenever we discuss what role engineers have or what obligations engineers have as engineers. And what we're doing in Chapter 10 is really talking about the nature of that special role engineers have as engineers. So we make distinctions in ethics about different roles carrying with them different moral obligations. So as a parent, I have certain obligations that non-parents don't have. And I have special obligations to my children specifically that other people don't have to my children. So while we can always say that everyone has an obligation in a very general sense, not to say harm other individuals or to be kind to other individuals, it turns out that I, as a parent, have a special obligation to my children. So I have a general obligation to be kind to people, say, or to not harm other people's children or whatever. But I also have special obligations to my own children. So I have to provide them, for example, with food and clothing and shelter, something that you may not be obligated to do to my children. And the same goes true of professionals and professional obligations. When people go into the role of doctor or lawyer or engineer, that role carries with it certain moral responsibilities, and that those responsibilities are often unique to the particular profession. But not only are they unique to the particular profession, but we as philosophers like to talk about what makes something a profession in general. So what is it in general that makes one's role special, that carries with it special moral responsibilities? And so part of what Chapter 10 is really spelling out what distinguishes a profession from a non-profession. What is it that makes engineering a profession? What then, if it is a profession, what sort of moral obligations then go with professionals in general? And then we want to talk a little bit about what engineers have specifically, what moral obligations they have specifically in their role as engineer. So I want to start with looking at what is a professional. In other words, what characteristics design a profession from a mere occupation. So I don't want to make a value judgment. It's not to say that occupations, things that aren't considered quote-unquote professions, are any way inferior. It's just that when you go into a profession, professions generally are viewed as things which carry with them special obligations. So, for instance, I might argue in business that I have an obligation not to deceive. I have obligations not to cheat or to steal. I have obligations not to harm people. And you might say those are obligations that apply regardless of whether I'm a business person or just a person on the street. On the other hand, we do look at certain professions and say they, in fact, do have a different kind of morality that applies to them. Sometimes it's a completely different system of morality. Other times it's just special obligations that apply because they hold a particular position as a professional. So lawyers are a good example, right? As a lawyer, I have an obligation, and in fact, I might even have a right to do things that you or I, as just regular citizens, don't have the right to do. So I can essentially lie in front of a court. Right? So when I present a defense of my client, even if I know my client's guilty, I might actually try to convince the jury that my client is not guilty. In fact, that might be my moral obligation as a professional. I have to put the best defense forth possible. I have to go after witnesses that I might know are telling the truth to look for any inconsistencies in their story. Now, you might say, well, yes, that's the lawyer's job. But it seems to me that if I try to make you look like a liar when you're not, if I try to make it look like you don't know what you're talking about when you do, then in everyday life, that would be seen as a bad thing. Oh, you're twisting my words. You're making me seem like I've done something I haven't done. And we would look down upon that. But as a lawyer, or when the practice of law, we would say, no, that's exactly what a lawyer is required to do. So we do look at professional obligations and professional morality slightly differently from other occupations. I don't think that when I go into a store that a sales associate should deceive me or lie to me or try to make me believe something is the case when it's not. Whereas with law, we say that's okay. And the same can go through with medicine. So if I look at a doctor, when I go to a doctor, if I come into a hospital, a doctor has the privilege, we might argue, to cut into people even though I don't share that same privilege as a regular citizen, right? So as a professional, as a doctor, they're allowed to perform surgery where those of us on the street, even if someone agreed to it, even if someone said to you, gee, I really don't want to pay to have my appendix taken out by a doctor, I'm going to say that you have permission to do that. We would still view that as assault, or at least from a legal standpoint, we would still say that that was assault. That no, you don't have that right. You don't have the right to do surgery unless you've gone through the training, unless you're a professional, that is, unless you're a doctor. So what does it mean to be a professional? What are the necessary, but not perhaps sufficient conditions for becoming a professional? Well, one, I think we know is that there's special knowledge, that when we look at the difference between an occupation and a profession requires some sort of specialized knowledge. It requires some sort of special skills. In the case of engineering, it might be calculation skills. It might be a facility with numbers or with drawing or with design. In addition to that, there is usually a certification that goes along with being a professional. Now, this is not true of all professions, and this is why we think that some of these are necessary but not sufficient. So it's necessary that we have special skills, special knowledge, and that we're certified, but it's not the case that that's sufficient. Just having special knowledge doesn't make you a professional. Having special skills alone doesn't make you a professional. In addition to this, we also think there are a special set of moral relations that apply to professionals. So all of these are in some sense necessary, and we can sort of abstract from engineering or abstract from these and say look at any profession. So considering an academic is normally considered a professional. So I, as your philosophy professor, am a professional. Do I have special knowledge? Well, that would be the knowledge that I've gained from graduate school, from getting a master's and then a PhD. Do I have special skills? In part, that might be the skills in critical thinking, reasoning, argumentation, might include teaching skills that are acquired through graduate school and then working on the job. Do you have to be certified? Well, for an academic, the certification might be the advanced degree. So it's not that anyone can teach at the university level. You have to have a certification. In other words, you have to have achieved an advanced degree. And then there's a special set of moral relations. And so the question would be, well, do I have obligations to students? Do I have obligations to the people I teach that are different from the obligations others have? And so all of those, now those are necessary, it seems, but are they sufficient conditions? Each individually are probably not. So let's look just now at the potential moral relations or the moral relations. Potential moral relations, and the reason the author is using potential moral relations is that our role as professional really doesn't come into play until we're in a relationship with others. So once we're in a relationship with someone else, our moral obligations sort of take hold. So while I may be a professional engineer, my professional morality doesn't apply when I am acting as an ordinary citizen. Now, what my moral relationship is specifically is going to be determined by each profession or by the profession that I happen to be in. So a moral relation and my moral obligations are internal to the profession. The profession is what it is because of its unique set of moral relations. So what differentiates the professional engineer from the lawyer or the doctor, or pick whatever other profession you want, is going to be determined by those special moral relationships it has. So lawyers have special moral relations to their clients, doctors have special moral relations to their patients, and engineers have relationships to the individuals that hire them or the projects that they work on. Professional moral relations require an engagement by others. So this again is just really restating the notion that once we have a profession and once a profession has its internal relations, its unique set of relations, then when I'm engaged to perform my actions as an engineer, this is when my professional moral relations take hold. This is when they are now applicable to a particular situation. Now, one of the interesting elements of a profession is that it's granted an exclusivity of service. And so sort of related or talked about this when we talk about lawyers and doctors, right? So the example of the doctor being the only one that can perform surgery, even if someone is trained to perform surgery. So maybe I have watched and have trained to do a particular procedure. That doesn't necessarily mean I have the right to do that procedure, right? That's reserved for professionals. And so not anyone can hang up a shingle and become a lawyer. Not anyone can be a doctor. We as a society have decided that there's a certain exclusivity of service. Others are prohibited from entering into that profession without the required qualifications. Not anyone can be an engineer, even if they've read a lot of engineering books. And so what this sort of brings out, and this is on page 88, it says what the profession then owe in return for its state-sponsored monopoly on a particular kind of service is that it benefits society in some more substantial way than by simply having its members practice their profession. So what this exclusivity of service, this monopoly of service does is generates an obligation in the professional to do some sort of social benefit. Other authors in professional ethics have actually made this case and added it to the list of necessary and sufficient conditions. So they said, look, if you want to define a profession, one way to define a profession is that at least one of the necessary conditions is that it provides some sort of social service, some sort of social good. So we give an exclusivity of service to engineers and to lawyers and to doctors, not because we just happen to like lawyers or doctors, but because this type of work they do is of such social importance, that it has such importance to society that we don't believe that just anybody should be able to do it. And so because of that, that generates an obligation on the part of the professional to behave in certain predefined ways. And so these ways are the sort of moral obligations that are carried with the profession. So for many, to be called a profession is to already implicitly have in there that what it is a profession provides some sort of social good. Now we can distinguish this from other sorts of occupations that while good in some way, maybe aren't as essential, so as an essential social service. So I might say, for example, that it's a good thing that there are multiple office supply stores. I like the fact that I can go to an office supply store and buy all kinds of pens and paper and pencil. It's convenient. I have all these things that I need right there in an office supply store. Now, while that's a benefit in some way to me to be able to go out and do that, it's not an essential service. If we suddenly found that there were no office supply stores, that I had to buy my pens and paper somewhere other than an Office Depot or an Office Max, I don't think society would suddenly collapse because of that. And so I don't want to say that we provide a monopoly to a certain office supply store or to one particular company, or only certain people can sell paper and pens. I think that would be kind of a silly thing to think. But on the other hand, I do think it's important to have people who are specially trained when it comes to those who are designing the bridges that I use or conveying the information from my computer to servers. I think that certain individuals are providing services that are of great benefit, and might even say essential services that society requires. And thus, I think we hold them to a higher standard. At the same time, we give them a certain privilege, right? Not everybody can do their job. So there's a certain protection involved in a profession. So what this then says is that our list of moral relations that we've talked about throughout the course, we've added, of course, role morality. We've talked about the special role that engineers have as engineers. We've talked about design solutions, external relations. So when engineers step outside and have multiple obligations to different individuals, engineering is an aspirational sort of relation that we're always aspiring or should always be aspiring to doing better. But also that one of the moral relations is social. By becoming a member of a discipline licensed by the state, an engineer has certain social obligations as an engineer and member of the engineering profession. So this takes the morality of engineering, the professional morality of engineering, and adds something more to it, a social component. It's not just about me as an engineer or you as an engineer doing what's morally required of you as an engineer, but it's also taking into consideration that part of what you're doing is social. Part of engineering is a social activity, not just an individual activity. It's not just about you as an individual, but you as an individual in relation to society. Now, the text makes sort of two distinctions. One, in the first part, is what we've just been discussing, is an understanding of sort of generally what it means to be a professional. So just to give a quick rehash, we're saying here that to be an engineer requires that you have special knowledge, special skills, that you're certified, and that you have a special set of moral relations that others don't have. And in addition to that, you as an engineer are providing some sort of essential service to society, and you're granted an exclusivity in that particular activity, right? So all of that goes to sort of generically what any professional or what all professions share. Now, there's also another sense of your obligation or your role as an engineer, and that's an obligation internally. It's an obligation to you as an engineer. What is required of you? What sort of special moral standard am I going to hold you to? And this is sort of an internal standard, and it's going to require that you have a certain knowledge that. And let me just talk a little bit about what the book was talking about. Knowledge that. It's one is you need to know more than just how to get to an answer. So much of your engineering training is going to teach you how to calculate, how to come up with a solution, what formula to apply in a particular situation. But it's also the case that you're going to need knowledge of other things to be a good engineer. So this is the internal or character sort of part of engineering. When you become a professional, and we've sort of alluded to this before, that professionals' obligations to keep their skills current. But it's not just their skills in engineering, but you actually need a broader sort of view of what you do. Psychological view. How will this design be received? What do I know about human psychology, human motivation? Physiology. What do I know about people and bodies and how bodies interact with their environment? So it's not just, do I actually have a good solution, or do I have a solution that I've used the tools I have to create? But do I understand how people psychologically will respond to that? In certain cases, physiologically, how will they interact with the artifact that I'm creating? And history. And surprisingly, history is important, even if it's a history of technology, right? It's an efficiency issue in one, so having a knowledge of history is efficient because you don't actually reinvent that which has already been invented, right? So the book makes reference to this. And legacy issues. Do I understand the devices that we're using? Do I understand the place of certain technologies within society, such as the typewriter, the Cadillac? Why are the keys on the keyboard actually aligned the way they are? That was actually a practical issue. It was to slow down people in their typing, which seems an odd thing to say now. We talk about people trying to increase their typing speed. And can you type 30 words a minute, 60 words a minute, 90, 120, whatever? We say, yeah, we try to achieve faster typing speeds. And it turns out that the keyboard itself was actually designed to slow down typing because of the mechanical nature of the typewriter, or early typewriters, I should say, before word processing. We needed people to go slower so that things wouldn't get jammed up. And the same was true of the example we gave in the previous chapter of the Cadillac trunk, right? Understanding the history of devices, the history of artifacts can avoid the problem with a Cadillac trunk, where something that everyone knows how to close, a car trunk, suddenly becomes a broken artifact when we don't take into account the history, right? The design solution was not appropriate for the vehicle, or the history of the vehicle, or vehicles in general, I should say. Now, in addition to knowledge that, we need to have knowledge how, right? So again, a further distinction about what engineers or how engineers should think. One thing that engineers need is a certain amount of creativity. And I would hope at this point in your engineering, perhaps if you're early in your engineering studies, you might not be thinking this way, but engineering is as much a creative endeavor as it is a empirical endeavor, right? So tracking consequences and seeing reverberations, it's a sort of imagination one needs as an engineer to think about how a particular design or a change to design will change the outcome, will change the artifact. So it's a sort of imagination. We tend to downplay things like imagination or art or those storytelling when it comes to engineers, right? Engineers aren't interested in English literature. They're not interested in imagination. What we're interested in is creation, right? We're creating a device. We're putting it down on paper. We're tracking out its implications, or maybe not even tracking its implications, but looking at the design and seeing how we can make that design more efficient and how that design would work better and be more sturdy. But really what we're also doing is a creative endeavor, right? You're tracking. You want to say, well, can I imagine what the consequences are of a change to any one design feature and how that's going to affect another design feature? And it's at times, it would have been extremely helpful, as we've seen in other chapters, if someone had thought about the implications of changing a design, of changing certain materials that are used in a design. How will this impact the next phase of the creation of the artifact? And so the knowledge of how one thing leads to another, how one thing has an effect on another, is an important part of being a good engineer. Right? You don't necessarily have to have this. You could be a bad engineer, but the knowledge how one thing changes another is important. And this is what the book refers to as projective history, how things will play out, how they'll play out internally within design, and how the ultimate ending, the ultimate artifact, will be affected by changes that are made at various stages of the design. So it is a form of imagination. It's a form of thinking through a project in a way that isn't just about making calculations. So those are obviously important, because part of this might be, if I make this change, I'm going to have to reevaluate, recalculate. But the ability to see that there's a necessity for the recalculation is part of this knowledge how. Right? And so this requires this sort of enormous care. And again, it's part of an engineer's internal obligation, right? This care in making calculations, but not only making calculations, seeing how one change leads to another, how one consequence, tracking the consequences of one design change to other parts of a design. And engineers need to know what will count, or what counts as the right sort of answer. So this, again, is sort of an imaginative endeavor, a creative endeavor. You say, look, it's not enough for me to calculate and get an answer, because I have to be able to say, is that answer correct? Or does that seem to be correct given what we're doing? So it's that ability to estimate. Right? So we don't now, more and more, we're being taught to estimate, to be more creative in our thinking. I have a 8-year-old who is constantly coming home with math where they are asked to estimate an answer. They don't want the specific answer, they want them to estimate the answers. When I was a kid, we never did estimations. Everything was, let's get the exact right answer. But you can see how estimation is a valuable sort of skill to have. When you look at two numbers and you say, well, given this, I should have an outcome that looks something like this, approximately like this. And if that doesn't come out, then maybe there's something going on, right? There's something wrong in my calculations if I don't come close to that. Or I've added something or taken away something that shouldn't be there. And of course, we're not thinking about in specific calculations here necessarily, but engineers need to know, well, what would the approximate right answer be? Because then I can see whether or not my calculations are right, or whether I've missed something or haven't included something. So the calculations could be completely correct, but I realize that the outcome isn't where it should be. And so maybe I've missed something. Not because my calculation was wrong, but because I didn't include something in my data set, right? And something that was necessary to come up or to get to the right answer. So again, just to reiterate, it's not enough to calculate an answer to a problem. We have to look at the problem and say, what other things ought to be there? What other things should I be thinking about? How design features affect each other, outcomes, reverberations, the care I've taken, what counts as a right answer. All of these things become knowledge how. So what all of this really is about is the nature of role morality for an engineer in general. So all of these various parts, what makes a professional, what I'm required, my knowledge that, my knowledge how, all of this becomes part of what it means to be a professional engineer and what it means to be a professional. So when we take on the role of engineer and we become a professional, we are entering into a form of life that's distinctly different than any other form of life. We take on different moral obligations, different way of thinking about things, different way of framing things in the world. So it really is something different than our everyday life. And oftentimes, in fact, our role as an engineer or as a professional, regardless of whether it's engineering or some other profession, often sort of seeps its way into other aspects of our life. So learning to think a different way is a necessary part of an engineer. And it's a necessary part of a professional. To become or to really be a professional is to be someone who has actually learned to think about things and look at problems from a completely different perspective. So professionals and as learning to think differently, paradoxically also need to think about the fact that they think differently. And so one of the examples mentioned in the text is the doctor, right? So we want a doctor to, in their his or her role as a doctor, we want them to look at symptoms and to be able to match those symptoms to particular diseases and look at the ways in which different elements of health interact to give signs that something may be one disease versus another and so forth. We want them to be clinical and professional and to look at the human body as a system that they're attempting to solve the problem with and so forth and so on. Yet at the same time, in taking that sort of very sanitary look at human beings, a very empirical, unemotional way of looking at things, we also want them to recognize that they are often clinical and cold and analytic in their approach so that they can actually have a better bedside manner. So one thing, and this is where the sort of paradox, well, on the one hand, we want to train the professional to think like a professional. We want to train the engineer to think like an engineer, to approach problems like an engineer, to internalize these sorts of thought processes as an engineer. And yet at the same time, you also need to be aware of the fact that you're thinking like an engineer. And this becomes part of being a professional, to recognize both when you're thinking as a professional and when you're not, and how there's an interaction, in essence, between you as a professional and you as an everyday individual. So we need to realize, in essence, our embeddedness in a way of thinking. And our embeddedness in a way of thinking, again, applies to all professionals. Oftentimes you'll hear this. In fact, maybe you know people already who are in professions. You say, well, see, that's the lawyer talking, you might say, or that's the doctor talking. I hear all the time from people, that's the philosopher talking, or that's the ethicist talking. And that sort of expression really is saying that, oh, see, now you've internalized, you've taken on that way of thinking that's particular to your particular profession. And oftentimes you have to step back and say, okay, that's fine. It's wonderful when you can think like a professional, but there are occasions when, in fact, it might not be a good idea to think wholly as a professional, right? For instance, it's oftentimes that as a philosopher, I might think in a very analytic way. And so that's not helpful when, for example, my daughter might be having a bad day. She doesn't want to hear about the facts and things. What she might want is just comfort. And so my recognition that sometimes analyzing the problem that she's having and talking about the possible solutions to that problem and how we should be thinking about this and whether it's an empirical or rational and blah, 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 all of those things are great. And as a philosopher, that might be exactly how you approach a problem, but it might not be what someone needs from the human side. So as a professional, we should be aware of those sorts of things, of making those distinctions. So just to give an example of this internalized thinking and how we should be recognizing our embeddedness and how we're approaching problems, is the Challenger example. There's a lot of things going on there. I just want to highlight a few of those things, or a few of the things we should be thinking about or we can learn from the Challenger explosion. And again, if you are not familiar, if you haven't read, you might want to go back and reread the account that's given in the text about the Challenger the explosion. One of the things we want to note is that decision procedures are not morally neutral. So we'd like to think that when we're talking as an engineer or as an accountant or whatever, that these are very analytic sort of decisions, that there's a procedure in place that are morally neutral, but they're not, in fact, morally neutral. So the example given in the Challenger explosion is the cost-benefit analysis is morally neutral, but it's not. It's morally loaded. And it's really a difference between minimizing potential losses and cost and benefit analysis. So it's just as morally loaded. So as an engineer, your obligations might be to minimize potential loss. Right? It might be the idea that what you're trying to do is make sure that you have the safest possible design, that your automobile or that your computer program that flies an airplane or helps fly an airplane is going to minimize the potential for any sort of loss. On the other hand, if you're not looking at it from an engineering perspective, there are others who are going to have their own sort of analysis, and that's the cost-benefit analysis, right? What are the costs relative to the benefits, downsides versus upside? And that's a different sort of approach to be taking, right? Whether you're sort of risk-adverse, where you're minimizing loss, or you're balancing cost to benefit. Those, again, are moral decisions that we make. I once had a student who said, well, philosophy is hard. And I don't like all this in ethics, all this sort of gray area in ethics. I like numbers. I see numbers on a spreadsheet and I can tell you what the result is. And my response is that, yes, it's true that you can look at a spreadsheet and you can give an answer and you can run your formulas and say what it's going to cost and here's what the profit you stand to make and so forth and so on. But I said, note that the numbers that make it into the spreadsheet, the numbers that are included in the calculation, are where the morality comes in. If you're excluding certain numbers, if you're excluding externalities, those sort of harms or benefits that may be imposed on others, then you're not actually giving an objective sort of account from your spreadsheet. So a spreadsheet itself, as much as we like to look at numbers as being objective, how those numbers got in there, what numbers are included and what aren't, isn't something that's morally neutral. That was a decision that was made. So when we're thinking like an engineer, and this is, again, one of the things from the Challenger explosion that we get, is thinking like an engineer require that we recognize other disciplines think differently. So had the engineers in the Challenger situation recognized that their argument should have been, look, I'm not thinking from a cost benefit. That's not what's relevant here. As an engineer, in a situation in which engineering was one of the sort of primary concerns, whether or not this was going to fail, whether we were going to have a booster rocket fail, was an engineering decision. It was not a different profession. This is not a business decision. This is not a cost-benefit decision. And there's a different morality that applies when we're talking about an engineering decision versus the other. And had the engineers thought that way, at least part of what had happened might have been avoided, right? Had they recognized that there's a difference in the way disciplines think. And quite honestly, it might have been where an engineer says, look, as an engineer, I am not going to change my view or just simply allow this to go through, because the morality that should be applied here is the engineering morality. It should not be the business morality in this case, or the cost-benefit analysis should not be the standard by which, the procedure by which we judge whether or not we should go ahead with a launch. So we need to recognize the limitations in our own way of thinking, or in fact, in some cases, the limitation in the way others are thinking. So the Challenger example sort of gives us both sides of that. Right? Recognize the limitations that I, as an engineer, am thinking from one perspective, whereas someone might be thinking from another. That's fine. But also to recognize that others are thinking, the limitations in their thinking. And this, again, might have helped in a sort of the Challenger sort of example, where business cost benefit analysis might not be the morally correct one in a particular situation. Now, we're talking in part about inner morality, and just to make explicit the sort of things we've been talking about, and inner morality is the morality that represents a professional's character. And professionals display their inner character in a number of different ways. And we've, in fact, touched on some of these. But to be more explicit, engineers display their character when they decide what problems they choose to solve, right? What they view as a problem in some way manifests our character, tells us what our character is like. How problems are solved is an indication of our inner character, right? Again, to what degree we allow our designs to be risky or error provocative. This is a character trait, right? Whether I succumb to pressures to make a less safe product and how I solve a particular problem is going to speak to my character. How engineers respond to the mistakes they make. So we all make mistakes, and all engineers should expect at some point they're going to make a mistake. And the question is, how are you going to respond to that? Are we going to cover up the mistake? So we look at the recent GM fiasco with their starters and what they did, and their number engineers were aware of some of the problems with the design. And it was actually, there have been some very interesting articles published about exactly what was going on, that it was a matter of millimeters and a slight little spring mechanism that actually changed the ignition, and that engineers were aware of this, and some sort of ignored this problem. Others made subtle changes. They changed parts numbers. They changed the part, but they didn't change the part number. But notice there's sort of a proper way to respond. There's a character issue here. If you see an error, you see a mistake was made, you see a corner was cut that shouldn't have been cut, or what thought would be a safety, or what you thought might be a cost-saving measure, might be more elegant design, and yet what happens is there's an error. And whether or not you admit to that error and attempt to fix that error is going to say something about your character as a professional and as a professional engineer in particular. So a question of character is really about our inner moral compass. An engineer, as an engineer, am I doing the right thing? Is this what my profession requires of me? Am I looking to consequences? Am I taking into account my obligation to avoid error, to avoid doing serious harm? Those are all character questions. Those are all inner morality questions. Now, it's important, I think, to distinguish, and the text distinguish between this inner morality and our external morality. So external morality is the morality that comes from outside, what we ought to do when we are stepping outside our role as a professional. What we ought to do as a citizen, for example, not what we ought to do as an engineer. And I think the really good way, and I think it's a really great example, is from the book when the author discusses the ethics of landmines. Right? So to distinguish between our internal morality and our external morality, everything we've been talking about up to this point right now has been about internal morality. Right? What are your obligations as a professional? What are the specific obligations of your profession? How should you think about problems? How should you think about the way you think? How should you recognize the difference between the way you think and others might think? What obligations do you have to others? All of those things are part of your character, how you respond to problems, how you respond to mistakes. Again, all internal, all part of you acting as a professional. But then there are the considerations of external morality, morality that applies to the rest of us. So the landmine example is a perfect example. We can have a debate about whether or not you as an individual ought to work on a project to develop landmines. Right? That's an external moral sort of consideration. Are landmines moral or not? Should you as an individual partake or be a part of a team that works on landmines? And then you can say the same thing. There are a number of people, for example, who have objections to working on projects that will lead to other sorts of weapons, right? So it might be fighter jets, or it might be missiles or whatever. And all of those things, you could have a legitimate sort of moral debate about whether or not it's correct to contribute to something that its sole purpose is to end the life of other people. So in the landmine example, we could have that one debate, and that would be an external debate, whether or not I should engage in that, whether anyone should engage in that, whether landmines themselves should even be made. But there's then the second sort of consideration is assuming that first part has already been made, the decision. So assume that you've already said, yes, I'm going to work on the landmine project. Then all of those internal moral constraints come into play. So you as an engineer then have an obligation to make the best landmine possible. So this sort of book notes how whether or not the landmine goes off prematurely, whether subtle vibrations will cause the landmine to go off, whether it's easy to arm or disarm the landmine. All of those things become an engineering decision, becomes a design decision, seeing how your design affects other parts of the design, how it's going to be used in practice, the history, and so forth. All of that becomes part of the inner sort of morality that you're required to be aware of. And so I think it's good to keep in mind that there are these two types of morality. There's the morality you have as a citizen, and you should, even as an engineer, before you apply, before you get into that relationship in which these other moral obligations apply, you really need to sort of act from both ends. You need to ask yourself, is this a project I should be involved with? Is this thing I'm developing, is this thing I'm working on a good thing? Is it a moral thing? Is it something I want to be a part of? And then once you've answered that question, then you should recognize that now I have a different set of moral obligations. And that's not always easy. It's not always easy to see whether or not there's going to be a conflict, because there can be, of course, obviously a conflict. Doing a very good job at making a landmine might be your professional responsibility, but landmines themselves may be morally suspect, right? You may be doing something immoral by developing a weapon that oftentimes hurts innocent people rather than the enemy or the aggressor. And so this becomes a conflict, but it's something that all engineers as professionals should keep in mind, that there are two types of morality. There's the internal professional morality, and then there's our external morality. And we don't want to sacrifice either of those, by the way. right? So sometimes the external morality might be something that you'll spend a lot more time thinking about, right? Because once you go into that mode as engineer, you know what your obligations are. You have a good sense of what it is you need to do, and you're going to do the best you can as an engineer. But the really difficult decision is, do I want to put myself in that relationship? Do I want to take on that role? Or do I want to use my role as engineer to develop this thing, whatever that thing may be?